India's relations with the Taliban government, Taliban regime, are based on what you could call realism and pragmatism. Afghanistan is a near neighbor. Afghanistan is a country which is extremely critical for India's security, and India must have some presence in Afghanistan. The contacts between India and the Taliban were there even in the 90s, but in the 90s the Taliban were far more beholden to Pakistan. They seemed to be far more in the Pakistani camp and a lot more hostile. When the Taliban took over Kabul, there were very serious apprehensions in India because of our experience of the 1990s, when Afghanistan seemed to have become a base of terror operations against India. India will still have a lot of reservations on some of the rather antediluvian and one could even go to the extent of saying unacceptable policies of the Taliban, particularly in relation to women. Taliban and the Pakistanis have had a falling out, and chances of any kind of their getting back together in the same cozy, comfortable arrangement that they had for decades, I think is negligible. The recent meeting between Indian Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri and the Afghan Foreign Minister Mr. Mutaki in Dubai has actually worked like a cat among the pigeons insofar as Pakistan is concerned. There are all kinds of bizarre conspiracy theories being conjured up by the Pakistanis. This meeting is being projected as a reaffirmation or a confirmation of the India-Taliban nexus, something that the Pakistanis have been going on for many years. Earlier it was India was backing the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. Now it is that India is behind everything that is happening in the AfPak region, and that this particular photo op or this meeting between the Indian and the Afghan side is really a confirmation of Pakistan's worst fears come true. Frankly, everything which comes from Pakistan is mostly nonsense. This is no different. But I think it is important to try and deconstruct what has been happening between India and Afghanistan, and how Pakistan figures in this entire equation. India's relations with the Taliban government, Taliban regime, are based on what you could call realism and pragmatism. Realism in the sense that the Taliban are the government in Afghanistan, and that India has always had this policy of dealing with whoever was heading the government. India would deal with them provided they were wanting to deal with India. So that was the realism part, and that there is really no opposition worth the name or nothing anywhere on the horizon to suggest that the Taliban are going anywhere anytime soon. There is virtually no resistance. There is some, but it is not of a level that can actually shake up the Taliban control over power. The pragmatic part of this policy is that Afghanistan is a near neighbor. Afghanistan is a country which is extremely critical for India's security, and India must have some presence in Afghanistan, apart from all the other stuff which is said about India and Afghanistan, the historical links, the fact that we've had very good friendships with Afghan governments over the last 80 odd years, even longer, and that, you know, our trade routes have come from Afghanistan. There are cultural centers in Afghanistan. One could go on and on ad nauseum repeating what has already been said by many people. But despite all of that, for India, it is important to have a presence in Afghanistan because of the criticality that Afghanistan enjoys in India's security environment. So, it is out of that pragmatism and the realism that India has not been averse to dealing with the Taliban. The contacts between India and the Taliban were there even in the 90s, but in the 90s, the Taliban were far more beholden to Pakistan. They seemed to be far more in the Pakistani camp and a lot more hostile towards India than they are now. So while there were those contacts in the 90s, they never really led to anything much. Also because every time any Taliban official tried to contact anybody in India, the Pakistanis got wind of it and they would squash any initiative from both sides to try and engage with each other. But I think during the foreign occupation in Afghanistan, during the time of the Islamic Republic, which preceded the Taliban regime, there were certain contacts that were established. Towards the end of the Afghan regime, those contacts were deepened, the frequency of contacts increased, and then when the Taliban took over Kabul, there were very serious apprehensions in India because of our experience of the 1990s, when Afghanistan seemed to have become a base of terror operations against India. Pakistani terror groups like the Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Harkat-ul-Ansar, the Harkat-ul-Mujahideen, many of these characters, even some Kashmiri groups, Hizbul Mujahideen and others, were known to have received training inside Afghanistan. We knew that a lot of arms and ammunition would be given to these groups, would be flowing out of Afghanistan into the hands of these terrorists, of course, courtesy Pakistan. So that experience was quite bad, including the entire IC-814 episode when the Taliban seemed to be hand in glove with the hijackers of that particular aircraft. Keeping that experience in mind, apprehensions in India were quite natural that if the Taliban, who for 20 years had received the support, the backing, they had received money, they had got safe havens, protection, diplomatic support, all kinds of things from the Pakistanis. There were serious apprehensions that they would be so beholden to the Pakistanis that we would see a repeat of the 1990s. There were some people in India who said that no, this time things will be probably different, provided the Taliban were able to be fully in command of Afghanistan, which happened pretty fast because the opposition to the Taliban virtually evaporated within a couple of weeks. And the Taliban did not face the kind of situation which they faced in the 90s when for almost 5 years they were fighting against their rivals and had not fully occupied Afghanistan even then. So this time the situation was different, but the apprehensions in India were that we would see a repeat of what was happening in the 90s. These were allayed by some of the Taliban leaders, including people like Mr. Stanakzai and others, who engaged with Indian diplomats and tried to reassure us. And then when the Taliban took over Kabul, the way they facilitated the repatriation of the Indian embassy and the Indians in Afghanistan was something that did build some amount of confidence. Since then, India and Afghanistan, or India and the Taliban, have engaged with each other. India has not broken the international consensus on the issue of official recognition, but India accepted Taliban requests to reopen India's embassy. And all of this has been a very calibrated approach. We've taken every step has been measured. Every step has been part of a confidence building between the two sides. So the Indian embassy was reopened. There are maybe a dozen officials who are posted out there. Their security has been taken care of by the Taliban, including the Haqqani network, which during the 20 years that was a war going on in Afghanistan, the Haqqani network was seen to be, to quote an American general, a veritable arm of the ISI. And yet the Haqqanis have given the Indian diplomats or the Indian officials full security in Kabul. Other Taliban officials have engaged with the Indian officials out there, and they have facilitated India's humanitarian aid to the Afghan people. Now, this was one of the most important things for India, that to the extent possible, whatever assistance we can give to Afghanistan to ease the lives of people in that country, whether it is food aid, medicines, and now after the latest meeting, there is talk of India restarting some of the developmental projects that some of them were left hanging when India evacuated from Afghanistan, and some new projects are also being considered, perhaps including some mega projects, hydropower projects on the river Kabul that has been on the anvil for very long. I'm not entirely clear whether that project is going to be started anytime soon, but it could be very much on the table. The process of engagement, however, does not mean an endorsement of Taliban policies. I think India will still have a lot of reservations on some of the rather antediluvian and one could even go to the extent of saying unacceptable policies of the Taliban, particularly in relation to women. In fact, on the issue of minorities, Taliban's track record seems to be even better than Pakistan's. While most Hindus and Sikhs in Afghanistan have left Afghanistan, but by and large, we do not see the kind of anti-minority actions by the state in Afghanistan as we see in Pakistan, where the Hindus are tortured, persecuted, their women are picked up, raped, forcibly converted. None of this has been happening or is reported to be happening in Afghanistan. But I think the single most critical factor that has deepened this engagement is the fact that the commitment that the Taliban gave us while engaging with us, that they would not allow Afghan soil to be used for any anti-India activity. The Taliban have lived up to that commitment. There is absolutely nothing that we know of where there is any sense that the Taliban are creating some kind of space for elements which are hostile to India. So that has given India a lot of confidence to upgrade the level of engagement with the Taliban. And the meeting between the Foreign Secretary and the Afghan Foreign Minister is part of that upgrading of the level of engagement. India, I don't think, is going to break the international consensus on according full diplomatic recognition to the Taliban. I think we will go with the international consensus on that issue. But below that, I think the process of engagement is well and truly underway. And what is important is that there are reports, nobody is really confirming it, that even the Afghan embassy in New Delhi probably now is going to get some Taliban representatives, perhaps at a low key, but who will handle the day-to-day kind of relationship between India and Afghanistan. The presser or the press release that was issued after the meeting, I think, is quite self-explanatory. Virtually everything that India was doing in the past is going to restart insofar as Afghanistan is concerned in terms of aid and developmental assistance to the Afghan people. There is a request from the Afghans for visas, for medical tourism, for students, and I think India is looking at that particular issue quite seriously. Where my difference with the government of India has been is that I am of the view that while we engage, and that's pragmatic and it's sensible to engage with the Taliban, we should also rebuild our political capital with the Afghan diaspora, many of them who are rivals of the Taliban and who are based in other countries. I think it is extremely important that those associations that we had for over 20 years, even longer, with the erstwhile Northern Alliance or the anti-Taliban forces, we should continue to cultivate those relationships because who knows, we might be able to play a part in Afghan reconciliation as and when an opportunity for that arises. But while the relationship between India and Afghanistan is going to be guided by the self-interests of both the countries, the areas of convergence are plenty. One is, of course, like I explained earlier, India's security interests in Afghanistan, plus India's desire to assist Afghanistan, insofar as humanitarian aid is concerned and developmental aid is concerned, which works very well for the Afghans as well. So one is that factor, but another factor is a much more strategic factor, which is, if you want to be very cynical about it, my enemy's enemy is my friend. Now, the thing is that the Taliban and the Pakistanis have had a falling out, and chances of any kind of their getting back together in the same cozy, comfortable arrangement that they had for decades, I think is negligible. The Taliban actually tolerated the indignities that were heaped on them by the Pakistanis when the Pakistanis were supporting the Taliban against the Americans and the Europeans. But they haven't forgotten those slights. They haven't forgotten the kind of mistreatment that was meted out to the Taliban by the Pakistanis. And of course, there are other compulsions, including the fact that they don't trust the Pakistanis. They feel the Pakistanis will interfere in their affairs, and there are already reports that Pakistan has started sponsoring some terror groups inside Afghanistan, namely the ISKP, that there are links between the ISI and the ISKP, number one. Number two, Pakistani media is constantly talking about Pakistan's support for the NRF, which is one of the resistance movements from the north. It's pretty small right now, but maybe the Pakistanis are thinking of building it up. There are also some reports coming out of Pakistan that they have cut off the Wakhan corridor, that the Taliban do not control the Wakhan corridor anymore, and that Pakistan is going to make that into some kind of an area which will act, number one, as a buffer for China. Number two, it will be a kind of almost like an autonomous, semi-independent part, which will then allow Pakistan to link up with Central Asia through Tajikistan. So there are those kind of very disturbing reports coming out of Pakistan's actions insofar as territorial aggrandizement is concerned. And then, of course, there are the constant clashes that are taking place between the Pakistanis and the Taliban, and the ratcheting up of attacks by the TTP on Pakistani military personnel and their commercial interests as well. Now, if the latest Taliban TTP statement is anything to go by, they are going to start targeting the military ink of Pakistan also. So this is the dynamic that is at play between Afghanistan and Pakistan right now. And frankly, it kind of works very well for us. The logic of the situation is that Pakistan exercises a natural influence in Afghanistan. But the problem is that the Pakistanis are so stupid that they have always misused the natural influence that they exercise on Afghanistan. They have overplayed their hand invariably in Afghanistan. And this typical Punjabi Muslim attitude of having a very overbearing attitude towards the Pashtuns and the Afghans, almost treating them like some kind of inferior beings, really is quite irksome for the Afghans. In fact, it's quite galling for them, and not something that they take to very kindly. So that is another factor that is at play, and what Pakistan has done is shot itself in the foot with this kind of an attitude. Now, the moment Pakistan does this kind of stuff with the Afghans, for the Afghans, it is natural to look towards India to try and balance out the Pakistan factor. From an Indian point of view, apart from everything I've said earlier that Afghanistan is critical for Indian security, it's also kind of a payback for Pakistan. We know that the Pakistanis are now trying to insert themselves once again in Bangladesh with the new regime in Bangladesh, and the anti-India elements in Bangladesh who are controlling that particular regime are opening the floodgates for the Pakistanis to come into Bangladesh, and the fear in India is that Bangladesh could once again emerge as a base for anti-India operations by Pakistan, exporting terrorists into India, jihadists, creating that jihad infrastructure in Bangladesh, opening a kind of a second front against India. And the way the Pakistanis, at least in the media space, the social media space, are chuffed up about the opportunity that they have now got to attack India from the east, is something which is of course going to be concerning for India. But I think this Afghanistan, in a manner of speaking, offers a kind of a payback for what the Pakistanis might be attempting to do on our east. Ideally, both sides should not be indulging in these kind of games, and they need to pull back and focus on their own development. But if you have an adversary like Pakistan, which is constantly trying to interfere in the affairs of its neighbors, constantly trying to stir up trouble in its neighborhood, then countries like India, Afghanistan, to some extent Iran, are left with no choice but to in a sense counter these moves by the Pakistanis. And I think that is the kind of a game that we might see unfold in 2025. There will be a lot of complications going forward, but I think this is a game that now is well and truly underway, and we'll have to see how it unfolds from here on.